Psychology in Action module, and we're on to the final lecture of this course, where we're starting to look ahead to the future and consider various different issues. And I do appreciate at this stage your dissertation is a long way off, but just sowing a few seeds which will grow and nurture over the coming year and then flourish by the end of the second year, hopefully. So we'll start to look at the second year as well and things you need there. Now, normally we would be holding tutorials as well if we were all meeting in person for anyone who needed a bit of advice and support with the assignments. Obviously, there's no point doing that via the PowerPoint, so I'll create another chat list or a Zoom, whichever you prefer and find easiest, and we can sit and talk to each other if you require one-to-one, or maybe small group tutorials might be easier and less time-consuming. And do it that way. But I'll create means for you to let me know what you would like and put that up on Brightspace. So what do you look forward to in the second year? Well, whether you look forward to it or not in the usual sense of the word is a different thing, but this is what you've got coming up in the second year as far as psychology goes. I'm not going to touch on what you'll have for sociology or any of the other combination routes that you might be doing, but just on the psychology side. So there are 3 modules which take place for psychology in the second year: Criminality, Deviance, and Psychopathology, which is a first semester one; Methodologies for Social Science, Applied Psychology, which is a second semester one, and first semester one, and Cyber Psychology, which is second semester. Now, in your second year, and I've uploaded a narrated PowerPoint about this onto the general Psych Soc Brightspace page, and some of you might hopefully have listened to that already, and so I won't repeat everything I say in there, but just to recap one little bit of it. You do a combination of modules, some of them are psychology and some are from your other route, and you'll do a dissertation prep module in the second semester, which is planning and organizing ideas that you might well be using for your dissertation. You do have the opportunity to change your mind if you want about dissertation topics, but it gets you into the mindset of thinking about all the things you need to do for your dissertation. Now, in any given year, you do 6 modules, and 3 psychology, 3 other route, plus dissertation preparation would be 7, and therefore you can't do 7, so you have to drop one. Now, you could drop one of the 3 on the screen here, one of the 3 psychology ones, or you could drop one from your other route. And it's entirely up to you which route you drop it from and which particular module out of your set of choices you drop. You'll be asked and contacted towards the end of the summer holiday to find out which one you want to drop, so that the class registers and attendance lists and what have you can be drawn up. If you're not sure which one to drop, you can talk to your tutor, whoever it is that mainly covers the subject in question, and ask them what's involved in the various different modules, and they can give you some feedback, and then you can hopefully make a decision from there. Usually most students just drop whichever one sounds the least interesting to them, or the least relevant to what they want to do career-wise, or what they want to do dissertation-wise. So what I'm going to do now is give you a brief overview of each of these 3 psychology ones, and if you want more information than contained in this lecture, then obviously get hold of me by email or what have you, and I will give you a bit more feedback on whichever modules it is you'd like to know a little bit more about. So if we start with the Criminality, Deviance, and Psychopathology one, kind of does what it says on the tin. It looks at a variety of issues related to crime and psychopathology. Psychopathology is just another word for mental illness. Now, it's not an in-depth look at all manner of mental illnesses. It's a look at those types of mental illness that overlap with criminality. So there are some forms of mental illness which could easily lead an individual to acquire a criminal record. So for give an example of one of the things we look at in this respect, pyromania is an obsessive love of starting fires. It's a mania for fire starting. And whilst possibly not every pyromaniac in the world will get a criminal record, clearly if somebody likes going around setting light to things, there's quite a strong chance that one day they might set light to something they shouldn't be setting light to and could end up on a charge of arson. So there are certain forms of psychopathology that do strongly overlap into the criminal world. And we'll be exploring those particular types of mental illness rather than a broad across the range look at mental illness. We'll go through a number of different types of crime, including some quite grim and unpleasant forms of crime, which obviously I don't know the details of the lives of every student. Some of you may have been touched by crime at some point in your life. You might have been a victim of a crime, or somebody very, very close to you may have been the victim of a crime. And so there is the possibility that some of these issues and theories we look at could be very close to home. And I'll leave it to your common sense to make a judgment call as to how comfortable you are with various different issues, and whether you feel this is something you could delve into, or maybe you might think this could be potentially too upsetting. And likewise, of course, mental illness can touch anybody's life. So people may have issues in their own life, or somebody very close to them has a mental health issue. And again, think to yourself about whether that maybe might make this subject all the more fascinating for you to know about, or whether perhaps you think it might be too traumatic and upsetting to know about. Your decision, your life, your call. We're all adults here. Deviance does include things that are neither criminal nor psychopathological, but are considered very bizarre or odd or unusual in any given culture or society. So we will touch upon a couple of examples of strange and deviant behavior, as well as criminal behavior and those particular forms of mental illness as we go along. And we'll include a couple of case studies of prominent criminals, for example, and people with serious issues and problems in their lives, as examples of how these theories and ideas play out. In terms of the assessments for this module, there are three. You have to write a case study, which is looking at an individual's life and the kinds of challenges and difficulties that they have in their life with respect to drug abuse and drug addiction. And you are offering suggestions for this individual as to what might be the causes of their problems, and also potential treatments and resolutions to help them. So it's a fictional person. You don't have to go and find a person to conduct a case study on. You're given some fictional character to conduct a case study on. Then there's a presentation in which you choose a criminal, ideally someone who's had books written about them, so that can help you with the research. They could be in for, any number of possible crimes that they may have committed, and you will be given a particular form that is used by prison psychologists to carry out assessments of prisoners, particularly when they're approaching probation boards and parole boards, to see whether they're safe to be let out. So it's a kind of like a safety assessment of how much risk this incarcerated individual poses to the wider community. And so using that form, you'll carry out an overview of this person's life and then present it to the class. Who they are, what crimes they've committed, factors, psychological factors involved in the commission of those crimes, and whether or not they pose an ongoing risk. And so you make a recommendation at the end of your presentation, should this person be released or not. It's to give you a flavor of what it's like to be a forensic psychologist within a prison, because this is the kind of thing that psychologists have to do with prison boards, is give presentations, not normally with PowerPoint, normally it's a verbal thing, but to give a presentation to a panel of people about the issues affecting a particular criminal and whether they're safe or not to come up for release. So it's a bit of kind of a professional flavour of what you might be doing once you've graduated, if that kind of career appeals to you. And there's also an essay addressing various issues where you're trying to explain how understandings of crime and deviancy and so forth have changed over time, and you pick a particular type of criminal behaviour, and you explain different understandings or different views of it in different cultures and different legal systems. We'll go over the details, obviously, when we get into that module, but hopefully this will give you a flavour of the kinds of expectations on you within that module. If you're nervous of presentations, I do appreciate that people quite often are, you do have the option to do a one-to-one presentation just to your lecturer, i.e. me, well, assuming I'm alive and breathing next year, of course, to do your presentation just to the lecturer. Presentations are recorded because that way the second marker can watch them and the external examiner can watch them. Once everyone's watched it and marked it and graded it and all the paperwork is finished, then the recording of your presentation will be deleted. So we're not going to put it out on YouTube for everyone to laugh at or anything like that. It's kept private, and you are allowed to see it yourself if you're interested in watching yourself and you think, well, you know, critique my own performance, see how well I did in that presentation, then you can have a copy of your own presentation and review it. You're not allowed to see other students' video copies though, but then the chances are you'll be sitting in the class listening to it as an audience member anyway, so you won't particularly need to see a videoed copy of their presentation. And there is the option of workshops to brush up your presentation skills over the course of the year, so you won't need to kind of go into this unprepared. You'll have a chance to improve your qualities and your abilities at giving presentations as you go along, if that's something that you feel you would benefit from. Okay, so that's that module. Moving on to Methodologies for Social Science Applied Psychology, which is a mouthful of a title for a module. This is quite similar to this particular module, Psychology in Action. It's taking it up a step, taking it on to the next level. So it's explaining to you how to use a particular computer package called SPSS, which is available on the computers at the college, or at least some of the computers in the college. And you can also get a trial copy on your home computer as a free trial download. I think it lasts 2 weeks, something like that. And then they ask you if you want to renew it and pay for it, but you don't have to do that. But it'll just be a way of you using it at home as well as being able to use it at the college. So you've explained how to use it, how to program in data for a minute. So you conducted an experiment, people have got their scores, you can put those scores into the computer package, press a few buttons, and SPSS will tell you whether it's significant or not, and it will create charts for you and graphs and various odds and ends that you can put into your reports, and provide you with all the sort of mathematical backup needed for a research report. Plus, we'll look in more depth than we have this year at various theoretical issues, and some of it, of course, your chances are you might forget bits over the summer holidays, and so the module acts as a bit of a reminder of issues you may have forgotten about over the summer in terms of how to conduct experiments, how to conduct research, or that sort of thing. In terms of assignments, you've got 2 reports that you have to produce. One of them is a quantitative report, let's say number crunching, and that is an experiment. Now, touch wood, coronavirus will be over and done with by then, and rather than the sorts of imaginary experiments we've had to do this year because of the virus, you'll be able to do the real thing next year. You plan, form small groups, plan your own experiments. There are guidelines on how to do that, obviously, and then you recruit a bunch of people, carry out the experiments on them, and write up the report about how the experiment went and whether you proved anything or you didn't prove anything. So not dissimilar to what you've done with a lab report this year, but hopefully a live experience rather than just a theoretical lab report. And that's followed up by a qualitative report in which you interview people and you analyse their interviews. You pick out interesting ideas that have cropped up in their interviews, which is referred to as thematic analysis, when you go around picking out ideas and highlighting themes and issues that crop up in the course of the interview. And then you do a report on what your interviewees have said and how you can relate that to theories and ideas and so forth. You have to find the people to interview. So I'll give you guidelines on what kinds of people to interview, but you've got to go out and dig them up. So that could be friends, it could be relatives, it could be people you work with, or somebody you know through social media that you can recruit to interview. So there's no great challenge in finding someone to interview. It's fairly easy to do that part. It's just the sitting down and analysing it afterwards and writing your report about what conclusions you come to in the course of conducting that set of interviews. So that's the methodologies module that you'll be doing next year. Well, depending on which modules you choose and which ones you drop, obviously. The other option cropping up in the second semester is cyber psychology, which is normally taught by Jill. Hopefully, presumably still will be next year. Cyber psychology looks at the impact of the internet on psychology, and it looks at it in a couple of different directions. Now, as you may have noticed yourself from your own personal experience, there are some people who seem to change a lot when they go online. They can be nice and quiet and timid in real life, but put them in front of Facebook or Twitter or some such thing, and they can turn into foul-mouthed monsters. And there are other people who go in the opposite direction. They're very loud and overbearing in real life, but perhaps very quiet and shy and retiring online. There are some people who will put up a fake photograph and pretend it's them, and pretend that they're a different sex or a different race or a very different age group from the one they actually are, and they'll create these online persona where they go around pretending to be quite different people from who they are in real life. And it's looking at all of the kind of psychological theories about why people act so differently. Well, not everyone does, but why some people act so differently online than they do in real life, and whether communicating with people in cyberspace has a significant impact on social relationships, how we learn about each other, understand each other, relate to each other, when you can't see facial expressions or get a tone of voice or body language or any of that, how we interact with each other on those sorts of basis. Some of it good, some of it bad. Some people get better, some people get a lot worse in terms of how they interact with each other. There's also a look at how the internet can be utilized as a research tool. So how gaining information off people via the internet rather than face-to-face, for example, as a research tool. Conducting therapy with people over the net. So rather than meeting up with a therapist and lying on a couch, the patient or client is at one end of a camera and the therapist is at the other end of a camera, and they're miles and miles apart and talking to each other in cyberspace. So uses for psychology, things like therapy, for example, or personality assessments, that kind of a thing, but conducted via the internet rather than via more traditional old-fashioned methods. And in terms of the coursework required for that particular module, there's a reflective journal which you keep over a period of time, adding in entries just like you would a diary or a journal, adding in entries about your own experiences with cyberspace, interacting with other people on social media, and linking that into theories around the psychology of cyberspace. And there's also an essay in which, again, you address various different questions and various different theoretical issues and link it into research and theory. So those are your three modules, your three options. And essentially you can do all three and drop one of the modules from your other route, or you might choose to do only two of these and do all three of the modules on your other route. Entirely up to you how you run with this. And as I say, you don't have to make that decision until towards the end of the summer holidays. So plenty of time to be thinking about it and mulling it over. If you want more detail about cyber psychology, your best option is to talk directly to Jill. If you want more information about either the methodologies module or the other module, then the criminality module, if you contact me. I will provide you with the information about those two modules above and beyond what I've already just said in this PowerPoint. So other issues to think about and consider as we draw towards the end of this Psychology in Action module. Those of you of a literary bent will know who Caliban is, and if you're not terribly literary, you might not have a clue who Caliban is. Caliban is a character from one of Shakespeare's plays, The Tempest. He's this horrible, disfigured, lumpy monster. Kind of person who these days would probably get elected to Parliament. Awful to behold. And at one stage during the play, he catches sight of his own face in the mirror, and he flies into a rage because he cannot bear to be reminded of how awful and ugly he is. And so hence the phrase Caliban in mirrors. It's someone whose rage is triggered when they're reminded about what they look like, either physically in terms of their facial appearance, or you can take that more figuratively in terms of being reminded just how monstrous your own behavior is and not liking that reminder. And this is something that's flagged up sometimes with respect to psychology, that quite often psychologists conduct research into various different areas, and some of those areas can be quite controversial, quite sort of challenging areas, looking at some rather grim features of human nature. And as a result of that research, the participants taking part in these experiments and studies and what have you may sometimes find out things about themselves which are shocking, which they might wish they didn't know, might upset them. Not only might it upset the individuals who actually take part in the experiment, but when it's published and written up as a book or a journal or what have you, then the reading audience might also find the data upsetting. They might not like the conclusions that the psychologist has come to. They might be a little bit shocked by the theories. When Freud, who didn't conduct much of anything in the line of experiments, it was all very theoretical, but when he first published his ideas and works back in the Victorian era, lots of people went absolutely ballistic about it and said how awful and terrible and shocking and dreadful it was, because he was talking about sex and incest and all sorts of grim, grimy subjects that the Victorian reading audience really didn't like. And they felt he was saying such terrible, awful things about human nature that it couldn't possibly be true. Or at least they really hoped that it wasn't true. They didn't want it to be true. Now, whether or not you agree with Freud, of course, is another thing entirely. Perhaps he got quite a bit wrong, maybe got quite a bit right, who's in an easy position to say these days. But it's often the case that psychologists can tell us things about ourselves that we really don't want to hear. And it begs this question of whether or not that is the job of the psychologist. Should the psychologist keep their yap shut and not reveal awful things to people about themselves? Or is it the actual job, the most key and useful feature of a psychological researcher, that they can bring this dark side out into the public gaze, where we are forced to think about these issues that most of the time we'd much sooner sweep under the carpet? That maybe, and this is Freud's point, maybe it's only by talking about it, thinking about it, discussing it, that these kinds of issues ever really get dealt with or resolved. Whilst we walk around with our head in the clouds pretending there's no problem, it's not going to go away, it's not going to resolve itself. An example of this, one you'll be familiar with, is Milgram's obedience experiment. And just in case anyone needs a little bit of a memory jog, Milgram, back in the 60s, got a group of people into a mock-up laboratory that he'd created in an area of the university. And there's this big machine with knobs and dials and what have you on it. And the people taking part in the experiment were told that there was a little man in another room who was wired up to this machine. And they would have to ask him a series of questions from off a clipboard. And if he got the answers wrong, they had to give him an electric shock. And each time they had to give him electric shock, it would click up to the next dial. So each shock would be stronger than the one before it. And so they sat there and they asked their questions, and he got some of them right and some of them wrong. And so they'd give him a shock, and there'd be an from the other room. And then a little bit later, they'd have to give him another shock, and the would get even louder. And the dial on the machine got into the red zone. And the red zone was the danger zone, the high-risk electric voltage, danger of killing the person in the other room. And some people refused to do it. They got so far and they said, absolutely not going to do this anymore. It's awful, terrible, shocking. I'm walking out. And they did. And other people, when Milgram encouraged them, said, oh, no, you must stay. You must keep going. No, you're going to ruin the experiment otherwise. They buckled under and they kept going. And a sizable chunk of these people, over 60% of these people, cranked that dial up into the red zone, whereupon there was a squeal and a thump as the person in the other room keeled over. Whereupon it was all revealed to them to be fake, that the person in the other room was an actor. The machine didn't do anything. It wasn't a real machine. It was just a prop. There were no electric shocks, and the actor was just faking being shocked. The point of Milgram's test was to see, would people inflict pain, suffering, and potentially even death on a random stranger just because some weirdo with a clipboard and a lab coat told them to do it? And the answer to that was, yeah, a hell of a lot of them would. Now, some people were very upset by this when it was told that, well, I suppose they were relieved in the first instance to discover they hadn't killed anyone. But then some of them got quite narked when they were told, oh, we just wanted to find out how mindlessly obedient you were and would you go as far as you did. That said, Milgram, when he was doing his write-up and responding to critics who were outraged at this experiment, said that actually the majority of people turned round and said they felt benefited by the sudden self-awareness, by suddenly realizing what they had been prepared to do, how sort of easily bullyable, how easily persuadable they were, and they would go home and have a good long think about themselves and what they were doing with their lives, and be a bit more independent and not so easily bullied and cowed by tyrants in authority trying to make them do dreadful things. So Milgram's argument was, yes, it was a little bit unethical doing this setup, but that the knowledge gained, the self-awareness gained, was worth it. And self-awareness not just for him, not just for the participants cranking the dial up, but for society at large to be shown how many people out there are willing to inflict pain and suffering and potentially even kill another human being if they are given orders to do so by someone in a position of authority. And the scariest thing about this, of course, is that these were just random people with a lab coat and a clipboard. They weren't generals or colonels in an army. They weren't political leaders with a great deal of power to wield. It was just some random bod in a lab coat and a clipboard. And so it's only just the trappings, the theatre of authority is enough to convince and cow a lot of people into doing as they're told. And this was the whole point of Milgram's idea. He'd, like everyone else, he'd seen what had gone on in the Second World War and how all of these people who in 1938 had been butchers and bakers and bank clerks and shoe salesmen had been given a uniform in 1939, told to join the army or navy or what have you, and some of them, quite a lot of them, had done horrifically awful things to other human beings. And then when they were called to account at the end of the war, had turned around and said, oh, I was only following orders, Governor, as if that somehow made it okay. And the question lots of people asked, sociologists, psychologists, politicians, religious leaders, and 101 other people, was, Is there something very peculiar about the German nation that they would behave in this way, but no one else would? Why did they do it? Because everyone was sitting there going, "Oh, I'd never do that. I'd never do that." And there must be something weird about these German people. And what Milgram wanted to show was that actually there wasn't anything weird about the Germans. That any nation on earth, and it didn't matter which country you did the test in, because lots of other people later on in the years to come, in the 70s and 80s and 90s and so on, in different parts of the world, replicated the experiment. They had men taking part, women taking part, white people taking part, black people, Asian people taking part. And it doesn't really matter what race, what country, what gender, what social class you're looking at. By and large, a significant portion of people do as they're told, even when what they're being told to do is inflict pain and suffering. So it cuts across all of these demographics, where all of these people sitting there wobbling their chops, going, "Oh, I'd never do that," were spouting hot air, because probably they would. The chances are they would. So that the grim face reflected in the mirror, which Milgram was holding up to society, was that pretty much any country, if it had its own version of Hitler stomping around in jackboots, giving them orders to go and do dreadful, horrific things, pretty much any country would find a large percentage of its population quite willing to go around and do dreadful, awful things. Not because they were terrible, sadistic monsters looking for any old excuse to do terrible, awful things, but because they were obedient. They didn't like to ask questions. And it's even grimmer if we bear in mind that none of the people in Milgram's experiment had a gun to their head. Had they walked out, nothing whatsoever would have happened to them. A soldier in the German army who refused to carry out orders would have been shot. There was a grim consequence for them in not obeying orders. There was absolutely no consequence whatsoever for the participants in these experiments if they refused to obey orders. So if you can get that level of obedience just by putting on a lab coat and going, "Go on, go on, go on, do it, do it, do it," how much more of a level of obedience would you get if you put a gun to people's heads and say, "Do this or I'll shoot you," or "I'll shoot your kids," or whatever? How much more obedience would you get? Hell of a lot more, clearly. So it's quite a grim revelation. So sometimes psychology, through experimentation, through research, can show us things about ourselves that really kind of bring you up to a halt and make you think, "Oh, where's the human race going? Is there anything we can do to counteract these sorts of problems?" Because this is only the first stage, of course. Shocking people is the first stage. Making them admit there is a problem is the first stage. The second stage is coming up with a solution to the problem, saying, "What do we do about this?" Okay, humans are depressingly obedient. Is there something we can do to give them a bit more moral fibre and backbone so that when some tin pot tyrant tries to bully them into stuff, they have the gumption to turn around and say, "No, I am not doing this dreadful thing that you are asking me to do"? How could we go about that? And that's where we move on to other branches of psychology, like positive psychology, which looks at the sort of creative, loving, caring, nurturing side of human nature and how that can be developed and encouraged and promoted. Why am I telling you about this? Partly because it's interesting, and partly because it might stimulate some thoughts of your own. Not necessarily that your research has to go out and shock, horror, and mortify people when you get to dissertation level, but that you can start thinking about serious issues. Because one of the underlying ideas of a dissertation is that it should contribute something useful to human knowledge. It shouldn't just be a 10,000 words of waffle sitting on the shelf. It should be something useful. And one way of being useful is that first stage, to say to the reader, there's a problem here. There's an issue here you need to be aware of about human nature. Do you realize this is what people are like? And the reader goes, that's a bit grim. Or you might want to go for that second stage of saying, well, someone else has already found the problem. Here's a possible solution to it. And moving it on from the grim research done by some other person to suggesting a way of counteracting that grimness. What can we do to improve human nature, to improve society, to make the world a nicer, better place? So you could hold up the mirror to Caliban, or you could suggest a solution to the problem because some previous researcher has already held up that mirror. You could go in other directions. That's only two possible directions for you to go. But something to have in the back of your mind, if it's just sort of floats around in your unconscious mind now, then by the time you get to your third year, hopefully it will have blossomed into something inventive and creative and of genuine use to humanity when they sit and read it and think, oh, that is definitely worth my time having read that. I'm glad I read that. I now know something quite useful I didn't know beforehand. It's better than getting to the end of a dissertation and wishing you could gouge your own eyes out, I can assure you. So, something to contemplate. A usage or two possible usages for psychology and for research and for study. Once you go into your second year, one of the things that you'll be encouraged to do, especially for psychology, is meta-analysis. Having an understanding of the overview of the kind of research and analysis that you're drawing upon in your assignments and essays and reports and one thing and another that you're asked to do. So in the first year, the tendency is to say, Freud said this, Skinner said that, Rogers said something else, to cite various researchers and what they say, and sometimes to cite people who've conducted experiments. Megagy did this experiment in such and such a year, and kind of leave it there, which is fine. It's a descriptive level, and the first year is largely about you getting to grips with describing psychological theory and psychological research. The second year, and on into the third year, is about critiquing and analysing research. Now, what does that mean? Because that's at this stage, it's probably just all hot air and words. So if you are citing Smith and Jones, who conducted some research in 1975, and that's part of an essay you're writing, is to mention that. Well, that's descriptive. Smith and Jones did some research in 1975, and this is the conclusion they came to, blah, blah, blah. How do you move into the meta-analysis? That's where you could start saying, Smith and Jones's research was conducted on 20 people who were all students at the University of California. So you're a bit more description, but you're starting to think about how the research was conducted. If they drew a conclusion and they only studied 20 people, is 20 people enough to make the conclusion they came to so concrete, so definite, so convincing that that theory should apply to the whole of humanity? I would suggest, most psychologists would suggest, no. You need more than just 20 people to make grand statements about the whole of humanity. So your critique, your meta-analysis, could be that whilst this theory the experiment was conducted very well, it was very efficient, and this theory appears to hold for these 20 people, more experimentation is needed, perhaps experimentation involving larger numbers, perhaps involving people from other parts of the world aside from California. So you're seeing, does it apply to younger people, older people, African people, Chinese people, French people? By replicating this kind of experiment in different places, different backgrounds, different types of people, bigger numbers of people, much like Milgram's experiment has been replicated and replicated and replicated by other researchers, that's where you then move to the point where you can say, well, actually, this is true of a lot of people. It may not be true of every human on Earth, but it is true of a lot of people because it's got lots of really good cross-cultural backup and diversity of research, different times, different places, different types of people. So rather than just saying this is true of students in 1970 from California, 1975 from California, you could then say, well, this was also true of people 20 years after, 30 years after, 40 years after, people from different backgrounds, older people, younger people, very mixed types of people, this was true of. So you start to critique the quality of the experiments that you're referring to, the quality of the research you're referring to. Was it really good research or was it rubbish research? So you could say, well, this theory is based on research conducted by Joe Bloggs. However, Joe Bloggs' research is now revealed not to have been very good for so-and-so reason. Therefore, we must question the validity of the theory based upon Joe Bloggs' research. So that's the kind of thing that you are moving towards and aspiring towards in the second year, is not just saying who did the research and when they did it, but going into a level of detail about the research, enough detail that you can then either say this is really good because X, Y, Z reasons, or you can say this actually isn't very good research because of X, Y, Z reasons. And that involves you critiquing the nature of the experiment. So that's why you have to do all of these methodology classes in the first year and the second year, is so that you can understand whether an experiment was actually any good or not. Because it's very easy to blind people with science, to go, oh, I've done research. And if they don't know much about research, they might sit there and go, oh, have you? I'm impressed. This is my impressed face. Whereas if they know a bit about research, they might say, well, what were your variables? How did you control for confounding factors? How did you sample your population? And if the research was conducted very, very well, good answers can be given to all of those questions. However, if the research was a bit shoddy and slapdash, then it might turn out, as the person struggles to answer those questions and ums and ahs and ers, that actually the claims they're making aren't up to much. In a similar way that when, let's say, politicians are quoting statistics to justify their actions. Oh, we're funding this because 95% of people said blah, 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 blah. If you understand how surveys are conducted and questionnaires are conducted, then you can start to pick apart those statistics and say, all right, fair enough. You conducted a survey and 85% of people said so-and-so thing. But when I look at your survey, I discover you only actually spoke to 25 people. And that's not good enough. Therefore, whether it's 85% or not is besides the point. Your research, your survey is not up to standard. So you can then, whether it's in the remit of an essay or assignment, or just you shouting at the telly when question time is up, you can then start to critique claims of research because you understand how that research is done. More importantly, how it should be done in order to base policy or theory upon it. So sticking with the idea of controversial topics for a while, if you're conducting interviews or questionnaires or surveys or something of that flavour, there are clearly what we might term hot topics out there in the world. And these hot topics will vary slightly from one decade to another. What people got very angry about in the 1950s might not be what they got very angry about in the 1990s. So issues come and go in terms of what gets people excitable. So let's go for something that's a very hot topic in 2020. We could say something like racism or sexism is quite a hot topic. The internet is full of mentally deranged individuals accusing each other of being sexist and racist and every other is to go in. Whether they are or not is a whole other story. But the accusations fly thick and fast. So it's clearly a very sensitive issue. No one wants, or no one, hardly anyone wants to be accused of being sexist or racist or any of these other ists, because it's characterized as a very negative thing to be. So if you decide you're going to do your research and you want to find out about racism, for argument's sake, or one of these other isms, we'll go with racism for the moment. If you go up to people with a questionnaire and say, oh, question number 1, on a scale of 1 to 10, how racist are you? What's the likelihood that you're going to get people saying, oh, I'm a 9, I hate them all? You're not going to get many people saying that. Maybe once in a blue moon you bump into Bernard Manning or someone and they're full in your face racist and don't give a damn, but by and large, people are going to play it down. They're going to give you what Paulus refers to as a socially desirable response, because they don't want you to think that they are racist. Even if they are, they don't want you to think that, so they'll lie to you, basically. They won't give you an honest, full answer. They'll give you a polite answer that sounds good, because they don't want you to think of them badly. And if you're holding your clipboard and asking them these questions in the middle of Bury St Edmunds High Street, maybe they're also worried about anyone else walking past listening to their answers, thinking badly of them. So they're going to give you managed answers. And that makes research into those kinds of topics, which often are of a lot of interest to students. Lots of students want to do dissertations and research on controversial things rather than dreary, dull, humdrum things. They want to go for some really kind of fiery, cutting-edge topic. And the challenge then becomes, how do you get honesty from the people you want to find out these things about? How do you get it? Well, you can try the direct question, is you a racist? You might get an honest answer, you might, but chances are you won't. So you might try subtle, indirect questions, where you try and you don't sort of go indirect. You might say, who are your top 5 favorite black movie stars? Because you've got some notion that a racially tolerant person would have lots of favorite black movie stars, whereas someone who really, really, really doesn't like black people probably doesn't have any favorite black movie stars. This is all assuming racism is against black people. There's other types of racism, obviously, in the world, but we'll stick with this example for the moment. You might take that as a kind of a subtle way to wean out what they're thinking, what kinds of reactions you might get. That might help, possibly. You could have repeat questions. Now, that's not where you say precisely the same question twice. That's where, in the course of a survey or an interview, maybe the first question you asked is phrased one way, and maybe the 5th or 6th question you ask is kind of the same thing, but phrased in a different way. And so you're seeing whether they are changing their answers radically, even though the question is really pretty much asking the same sort of a thing. It's just slightly reworded. So it's there to see consistency. The assumption is that honest people are consistent in their honesty, whereas dishonest people might forget what they've just told you and tell you something slightly different a little bit later. That's one way of checking for a sense of whether this person is being wholly honest in their answers. Or you might look for implied evidence. This is where it's perhaps assumed that the way people react to certain things suggests the state of mind behind their reaction. And it can be quite, sometimes it can be, well, stretching the point a bit, let's put it like that. You've got to be pretty damn sure that your implied evidence really does imply what you think it implies. Because it's very easy to do some very shoddy, rubbish research by coming up with unconvincing forms of implication. So to give you an example, there was an experiment done which involved showing people a series of photographs and then asking them to press a like or a dislike button about whether they like the face or dislike the face in the photograph. And some of the faces were white people, and some were Asian people, and some were black people, and so on. And they had to press the button. And what was of interest to the researcher was how long it took them from being shown the face, the photograph, to pressing the button. And so the researcher's argument is that the longer it took them sort of dithering and umming and ahhing before they pressed the button, the less honest the response would be. So even where the person pressed the like button in response to seeing a black person's face or an Asian person's face on the screen, if they took longer than the average amount of time they were pressing for the white faces, the researcher interpreted that as implying a degree of racial prejudice. So the person did press the like button because they wanted to convey positivity and the social desirability of Paul's idea, but they took 3 seconds rather than 1 second. Therefore, that 3-second delay suggested that they didn't really like it, but they just pressed the button in order to make an impression. Now, how do we know that is what was going on in the minds of the people pressing the button? Do we know they were sitting there for 3 seconds thinking, oh, it's a black person, I don't know whether to press the button or not? Or do we think they were maybe sitting there thinking, is that person famous? Who the hell are they? Do I know them? I'm not sure. And then press the button accordingly. There could have been various factors going on in their minds which speeded up or slowed down the rate at which they pressed the button. So is it sufficient to say, oh, well, you took 5 whole seconds to press that button, you must be a racist in it because of this reason? Or is that rather a dubious conclusion to draw? I'll leave you to think about that one. Suffice to say, if you're going to use implied evidence, so you don't ask them the question directly, you get them to do something, and then you interpret what they've done as implying whether or not they hold a certain point of view. You need to be confident that your measure of implication really does measure what you think it does, what you want it to. And you're not just scraping the bottom of the barrel looking for something that frankly isn't very good evidence of anything, but you've chosen for reasons of your own axe grinding to interpret it in a certain way rather than to think of it in a broader perspective. But the question remains, if you're going for a controversial subject where people might well lie about their views and their ideas and their understandings, what can you do in terms of shaping the research to try and elicit a more upfront, more honest response from them? There are ways and means, and this is just some of, there are other ways and means out there, but this is some of the ways and means to think about. So this is an example of an experimental process done. I don't know who the white guy is, I have no idea who he is, but obviously that's Barack Obama. And 2 versions of Barack Obama, one in which his skin is photoshopped to make him look very light, and one which I think is his natural skin color. I don't think he's been darkened by Photoshop or anything. I think that's the central picture is just what he actually looks like versus the photoshopped lighter picture. And the purpose of this experiment is these faces were flagged up on the screen, photoshopped and normal faces, and the eye movement was measured of the participants. So did they look at the paler skinned face first, or did they look at the darker skinned face first? And it was then interpreted to imply, if they looked at the paler skinned face first, this must show a preference for pale skinned people, white people if you like, although obviously Barack Obama was mixed race. Whereas if they looked at the darker skinned face first, this must have shown a positive acceptance of darker skinned people, African, Asian, Indian, etc., skinned people. Is that a valid measurement? If you were shown this picture, would you maybe look at one and think, is that Barack Obama? Does he really look like that? And therefore your eyes might be drawn more out of slight surprise because the photo doesn't look quite right, rather than out of prejudice. If these were faces of people, just random people, not famous people, unknown people, where you wouldn't have a clue what their natural skin color was, then maybe that would be a better measure. But because this is a famous, very famous person, the sense of that photo looks a bit weird, arguably might draw people's attention, regardless of whether the person looking at the photograph is themselves black, white, or what they might be. They may be drawn out of oddity rather than the preference of skin tone. So again, it's kind of the difficulty in these forms of implied evidence. How do you know why someone does what they do? Because you're not, as part of the research, actually asking them, why did you look at photo A rather than at photo B? So it does seem as if, personally to me, this kind of research is scraping the barrel of plausibility. But you may have different interpretations and different feelings about how effective some forms of research are compared to other forms of research. Now, in terms of forms of research and what can be measured and evaluated and so on, one option, if you get fed up asking people endless questions in surveys and interviews and things like that, is to consider physiological measures. You can measure brain waves, you can measure heart rate, you can measure galvanic skin response, which is the electrical current that goes through someone's skin. We all have one normally, but when we get nervous or anxious, it tends to increase. And it's one of the methods used for supposedly detecting dishonesty and lie detecting. It's a bit of a hit and miss method of evaluating dishonesty, but it is used in some parts of the world as a method of trying to evaluate whether someone is dishonest or not. Now, at Ipswich, at the moment, and I do say at the moment, we don't have quite this level of technology. So at Ipswich, at Bury St Edmunds, we don't have quite this measure of technology available. Although with the Vinton Centre and new equipment being added as time goes past, possibly at some stage within the quite near future, we might get more forms of equipment that would be useful to psychologists as well as other types of academic for these forms of physiological measure. They do have a greater range of devices available on the Ipswich campus, and should you decide that you want to do your dissertation in a couple of years and integrate some form of physiological measure into your dissertation, whether it's heartbeat or galvanic skin response or what have you, then Ipswich has said they're happy for us to book, the staff can do it on behalf of the students, to book students space in their laboratories when obviously they're not being used by their own Ipswich students, to go in and utilize some of the equipment for their own research. That doesn't include, things like functional magnetic resonance imaging. That's pretty heavy duty, super duper expensive equipment, the kind of things you find in hospitals rather than the kinds of things available in Ipswich or Bury university campuses. So you don't have a full range of every conceivable device going, but there are a range of devices available at Ipswich, and we might possibly be getting some of these devices in Bury as well at the new science block. Time will tell. So there is the possibility that if you are interested in biological measurements and using this as a way of assessing what people say, what people do, maybe checking out whether you feel their answers to questions are true, or monitoring eye movements, what kinds of things they're looking at. If you show them a series of images, do they look at this image rather than that image? Durations of time they spend looking at things, the equipment necessary to measure those sorts of biological responses is available. So this opens up that possibility for forms of research. Now, as a matter of course, in the modules we have at the moment, we don't expect you or require you to engage in this sort of research as a standard part of the lessons. But that's no reason why you might not be exceedingly interested yourself in these things and want to incorporate them into some of the things you do, which could include, for example, elements of it coming into the experimentation for the research methodology module, or indeed, I already mentioned your dissertation in the years to come. So just to flag up the possibilities of these things there for you to think about. Other approaches include observational methods. And this is something we'll go into more detail in the second year on how observational methods work. But you primarily have two approaches, covert and overt. Covert observation is where you monitor behavior in a group of people, or indeed in one individual person for that matter, without them knowing that you're monitoring them. A number of ways you could do this. At the comedy level, you could just hide behind a bush and watch what they're getting up to. At a more sensible level, you could be a person in a crowd. So you could be sitting, let's say, in a coffee shop, staring out the window, watching people coming and going in the streets. They have no idea what you're looking at and probably don't even realize half the time you're actually sitting there, but you are recording, monitoring the comings and goings of people in the streets in a naturalistic sort of a setting. Or you could use CCTV, various other kind of, well, for lack of a better word, spy camera type devices that monitor people coming and going and what they're getting up to. That there are legal issues involved in who you can spy on and where you can set these devices up and that sort of thing. And we'll go into those practicalities in the second year. But there are various ways in which you can monitor people without them necessarily needing to know that you're monitoring them. And the arguments in favour of that is that people are more relaxed. They'll behave in a more naturalistic way if they don't know they are being monitored. There are potential risks. You might see them doing things you really wish you hadn't seen them doing. And sometimes naturalistic behaviour, let's face it, can be a bit gross. Do you really want to watch people picking their nose and scratching their nether regions? You might see that. You might become privy to conversations you wish you hadn't heard when they're talking about things you would have been much better off not knowing about. That's a possible risk, but equally you're going to see their more naturalistic behaviours. Or overt observation when they know you're watching them. They can probably see you. Chances either, you could set up a camera and say, look, there's a camera in that corner. I'm going to be videoing what you're doing for the next 3 hours. Or it could be you yourself with a clipboard sitting in the corner on a chair watching what they're doing. It's upfront, it's honest, it's open, it addresses a lot of ethical concerns about dishonesty and deception. The downside, the limitation, of course, is that, and you may have experience of this yourself, if you know someone is watching you, it makes you very self-conscious. And you're not relaxed, you're not likely to behave in a normal, everyday fashion. You're on your best behavior because you know there's some weirdo over there with a clipboard watching what you're getting up to. And so it questions how useful the quality of information gained from the observation is if those people are very tense and behaving in a somewhat artificial fashion. So you might want to do this for elements of projects next year. And this can include not just watching people in the flesh and blood. So for cyber ethics, part of your journal could be observing how other people behave in cyberspace, what kind of messages they say to each other, how they respond and interact with each other. In a sense, you're sitting observing that. You may not be able to see them as flesh and blood people, but you can observe the manifested behavior they engage in online, what they type, what emojis they use, all that palaver. So that's a form of observation. And you might want to consider observation perhaps for your dissertation, depending on the subject you're interested in. Could be useful, could be something you could engage in, something to think about and mull over. Now, we've touched on these before, these big traditions in psychology, but just a very brief recap of their role within respect, at least, to methodologies and styles of research. Behaviorists love to measure behavior, hence the name. So it's monitoring what people do. Now, that can be observational monitoring, people coming and going in a crowd, or it can be putting people into an experimental situation and watching what they do next. So it's less about what's going on in their head, their thought patterns, their feelings, their emotions. It's more to do with monitoring that outward behavior, not trying to theorize about their motivations, which is very internal, but monitoring their outward behavior, counting how often they do something, how long it takes them to do something, the levels of accuracy with which they engage a particular task. Those elements of experimentation, measurement, and observation tend to be key features of behaviorism and fit well within that philosophy. The psychodynamic approach does not have a long history of experimentation and research in that way. So they tend to use, and certainly Freud did, and it's set an agenda for a lot of psychodynamic theorists in the years since, make a lot of use of case studies, looking at a small number of people in a lot of depth and monitoring their changes in psychological condition over a period of time. And then theorizing that what is true of these handful of people might well be true of a lot of other people out there in the world. So it's not so much that kind of large number of people being monitored for behavioral changes that a behaviorist would engage in, but usually tends towards more case study or interview-based in-depth, open-ended interviews, again, usually with a fairly small number of people, to really try and get inside their minds, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their points of view are. Sometimes it can make use of things like visual autoethnography, which is a style of analyzing art, photographs, newspaper imagery, magazine imagery, cinematic imagery, to understand the meaning, the symbolism. It's an area referred to as semiotics, understanding the nature of symbols as they're used in creative forms of art and expression. So that's sometimes of appeal to psychodynamic theorists. They're very interested in dreams and the way the unconscious mind conveys things in images. And so artwork and stage plays and cinema and TV shows can all be seen as having this rather dreamlike quality of expressing imagery from the scriptwriter or the director or the actors and various other people involved in the process as they create these images for people to observe. Psychobiology is picking up on all those sorts of measurements of neurochemistry, fluctuating chemicals in liquid within the brain or within the blood or various other parts of the body, monitoring brain waves, monitoring galvanic skin response, monitoring eye movements, monitoring all sorts of physiological phenomena inside the body or outwardly. And things like galvanic skin response that you don't need to, well, to put it crudely, you're not shoving anything inside someone. You're just attaching electrodes to their skin to monitor the skin response. So there's intrusive and non-intrusive techniques used in psychobiology to monitor what someone's body is doing. And this can be married up with external stimulus. So you could show them a picture and monitor their heart rate in response to the picture. Or you could get them to listen to music and monitor electroactivity in different sections of their brain. That sort of thing. So there's usually, not always, but usually an external stimulus, and then the interest is on measuring biological responses to that stimulus. And again, not so much an interest in thought patterns or internal motivations, more just focusing on the biological shifts and changes, different brain areas fluctuating and some peaking and some slowing down in terms of electrochemical activity and so forth. Social psychology makes usually a lot of usage of observations. Much of it tends to be more naturalistic observations and field work rather than laboratory-based experimentation, because the aim in social psychology, especially these days, more so than a few decades back, the aim is to get a sense of how people behave naturally rather than under somewhat artificial laboratory conditions, and the social interactions between people. who says what to who smiles, who scowls, body language, all the interactions going on between a bunch of people, who takes a leadership role, who takes a follower role. Those sorts of issues are the things that tend to interest social psychologists. And so a lot of it is getting out there into the real world, observing, monitoring, maybe instigating a little bit of change and then seeing how people respond to the change. Action research, those sorts of methods and approaches as ways to understand and observe what's going on at a social level with human interaction. Humanistic psychologists tend to favour, again, a little bit like psychodynamics, with case studies, in-depth interviews with people, especially very open interviews, letting the interviewee lead where the interview goes and following their self-expression, their humanity, getting a real sense of who they are as a person. It tends to focus on the the ideographic, the individual and their life experience, rather than trying to make grand non-aesthetic statements about large numbers of people. And again, imagery, semiotics often plays a strong role there. Humanistic therapies frequently draw on things like art therapy, music therapy, drama therapy, creative self-expression, with the therapist monitoring what is expressed, then analysing the symbolism and meaning of what's being expressed through therapy to try and assess how much better someone is getting or worse that they might be getting, and so forth. And so an interest in how people communicate, analysis of dialogue, narrative analysis, dialectic analysis, various different forms of understanding how people communicate, express themselves, create themselves in the moment. All of those types of methodologies tend to be of more interest to humanistic psychologists than the experimental methods or the number crunching methods, which don't tend to appeal to humanistic psychologists very much. And then cognitive psychologists, sort of diametrically opposite really to behaviorists, are very, very interested in what goes on inside people's heads, much more so than they are in outward behavior. So it's trying to work out what people are thinking about to a heavy extent. There is a branch of cognitive psychology that overlaps heavily with psychobiology, monitoring things like eye movements and the speed with which tasks are carried out, and the kind of thinking, problem-solving processes behind that. So there is one branch of cognitive psychology that shifts quite heavily and overlaps into the psychobiological domain, but the more therapeutic branches of cognitive psychology are more interested in how thought processes lead to emotional responses and behaviors, and how by changing the thought processes you can change behavior, you can change emotional responses in individuals. And so it's getting to those thought processes, which can be through questionnaires, through interviews, through implied responses to various different stimuli. So it can include a fair amount of experimental focus, but the focus is ultimately on trying to find out what people think, rather than just concentrating on how often or how quickly they do certain things. Now, having spoken about positivism and interpretivism at great length in previous lectures, you may feel by now that you've either got to be one or you've got to be the other. And certainly there are some people who are definitely positivists and some people who are definitely interpretivists. But there are a fair amount of researchers who would describe themselves as pragmatists. That is to say they come down somewhere in the middle. Their interest is in whatever subject it is they're researching into, and they will use whatever methods, whatever methodologies, whatever techniques seem most useful at the time for getting the kind of information they want. So they're not hardline always positivists, they're not hardline always interpretivists. They'll chop and change and adapt and use mixed methods and a bit of this and a bit of that, as long as it gets them the information they're looking for. So that they are in the middle. They are combining elements of both other sides. And it might be that by the time you get to either conduct research in the second year or you're planning your dissertation for the third year, that you might want to take a more mixed methods, pragmatist approach, and just use whatever kind of methodologies seem to work best, rather than being hardline positivist or hardline interpretivist in your approach. There's another option out there. Which brings us to the end of this module, or at least to the end of the lectures. So you don't have to listen to me wittering at you for a few months over the summer holidays. You'll get forms circulated around asking for your feedback on whether you enjoyed the Psychology in Action module, which bits did you like, which bits did you dislike, did you get enough help, were the lectures useful, were these recorded lectures useful, asking for your general feedback. So please fill in those forms when you get them, if you haven't already got them. And what would be useful to me, whether you want to put these on the forms or just give this feedback to me separately by email or what have you, is for me to know whether there are any subjects you wish had been covered that were not covered, so I can then add them in for next year's students, or equally, if there are any subjects which you got sick to death of hearing about, which you would suggest I cut back on for next year's students. So in terms of what I put in next year's module, it would be quite useful to get some practical feedback on how to amend and change elements of the module, so it's better for next year's students. But other than that, take care. I will create some chat spaces and all the rest of it so you can discuss your concerns that some of you may have around your assignments, any last minute worries and issues, or if you want advice on next year's modules or summer reading or any of that kind of thing, you can talk to me through those forums as well. I'll set up a chat room and let you know times and dates. If you would prefer Zoom, because you would prefer to look at people rather than just read typing, let me know, and I will set up either a Skype or a Zoom or what have you, so you can, well, I'm sure you don't really want to see me, but you might want to see other members of the class and have that kind of face-to-face contact and jollity going on there. But let me know what you want and I'll arrange accordingly. But that, you'll be relieved to know, is the end of the sermon, the end of the lectures. Thank you for listening and stay safe.